And the reason they weren't living there is because it was full of bad spirits, because of the carnage that had taken place there many hundreds of years ago. That's what allowed Boonesboro to get settled and established before the Shawnee in Ohio could come down to Boonesboro and attack it a distance of 200 miles away. Because they only came in here to hunt. They take the game and they go out. Take the game and go out. They would not live here. This was taboo. And they could not understand why the white man would live here either. That's another story. Now, I'm postulating if these are the Nephites, and I can't say they are positively, but if they are, what I'm claiming is that possibly this group was trying to get back to here, the fortified area in the center of the land that had worked for them many hundreds of years previously, to come back here and resettle in the center of the land, the forts that went across from the Ohio to the Mississippi. Here's where we have our strongest lead for the elimination of these men on the great fight at the island. This comes from a paper read before the West Virginia Historical Antiquarian Society in 1897. Dr. Hale remembered that according to local tradition, Indians had repeated to settlers tales that they had heard from their ancestors about a race of white or light-skinned people, originally from the east, which had dwelled in large numbers a long, long time ago in the Ohio Valley. Chased by warring red men, these ancient Caucasians fled westward to the falls of the Ohio River near Louisville, Kentucky, where a bloody skirmish took place. Several hundred pale-faced survivors sought refuge on an island below the falls. With tomahawks raised and arrows aimed, the Indians attacked again. Not a single white person lived to tell the story. The fact that these early settlers found a great number of human bones on that island lends credibility to this legend of the lost tribes of whites. Well, what's that, folks? Hebrew menorah. It's in a cave in southern Michigan. And the Potawatomi Indians who own that land tell us this is their stuff. Isn't that something? Hebrew menorah, a 3-base menorah. One of the biggest stereotypes we have to eliminate out of our minds immediately is this idea of how the Indians looked. If you go back in the early history books published in the 1800s, you will find the Indians of the East wore turbans. They wore long sleeve shirts and they wore breeches. Long breeches right down to their ankles. They didn't run around with feathers in their hair and their hair all greased back with bear grease like we see in the movies and wearing war bonnets. That's Western Plains Indians. The Indians of the East had turbans. You go to the state of Ohio, go to Columbus, and there you will see paintings like this of all the great chiefs historically preserved in the museum at Columbus, Ohio. And every single chief has a turban, not feathers. This is what's called an Adena mound. The Adena mound people fit the timeline of the Jaredites. And I have this picture here. This is my wife, Chris, so you can appreciate how big these things are. They're huge. This one here, the base of this, is larger than the Pyramid of Giza. If you can imagine that, if you've been to Egypt. There's only 2 men buried in here. 2 guys. Here's a drawing. They'd first build an altar, do their ceremony, and then with all kinds of layers of rock and gravel and certain types of clays, and then they'd put a guy right about here, dead center in the middle. And sometimes they'd have 2, one be buried here, one be buried there. This is very typical of the Adena mound, the Jaredite timeline. Next one. This came out of the Grave Creek Mound. This is called a Paleo-Hebrew or Canaanitish language, which has been translated 4 different ways. So I'm not going to read it because they all conflict with each other. But all 4 translators agree that the people that built this mound definitely had a written language. And this is evidence of the language right here. And we are taught in our schools and universities today that no written language existed with the Indians of North America. And I'm saying that's absolutely false. There are plenty of signs like this. This is just one. I'll show you a few more. This is Marietta, Ohio. If you can see the outline here today, these are the streets and the city blocks of Marietta, all crisscrossing, superimposed on top of the Hopewell site that was there. The red part is what still remains of the Hopewell site. What's interesting, these are 2 temple platforms. This is a walkway to the river. This right here is one of those big Adena mounds. Now my question is, what is an Adena mound doing inside of a Hopewell city? Because it doesn't exist anywhere else, all the way to Missouri. You won't find it. You only find one here. And I'm just going to make a theory, okay? How long did the last surviving Jaredite live? What does it tell us? 9 what? 9 moons, 9 months. Is it possible, because he was a king, just possible, that maybe the Nephites that found him, that they buried him in the way that he would have been buried by his people, and built him a huge, what we call an Adena mound? I'm just putting out there for thought. Let's take a look at it. The mound has been preserved because the people, the pioneers that first came there, they put a cemetery next to it, and it's continued unto this day. The whole thing is surrounded by a regular cemetery. Here's the special mound right here. This is not a Hopewell mound, it's an Adena mound, but it's inside a Hopewell city, which exists nowhere else. Just a little food for thought. It's never been dug. It's never been dug. Next one. Around the Adena mounds, what sets them apart is that they always put a ditch around their burial mounds. And this is the ditch. You can see the earth, the stones of the cemetery here. This is the ditch. It goes all the way around the mound. It's just something they did. We don't know what it means, but that's what they did. This right here, January of 2001, this was the first thing that I saw come out on the DNA question. And in here, they identified 4 major DNA strains, A, B, C, D, and then they mentioned one that was really a surprise. It was called the X factor. And that X factor did not belong here because it carried a strain that went somewhere else. And I'm not going to say anything because tonight we're going to hear from Rod Mellendrum right now. And Rod's going to jump in here for about 15 minutes and tell us about the DNA strain called the haplogroup X factor.
How many of you, by show of hands, have heard anything about, a little controversy going on as far as DNA? Anybody heard about that? Okay, all right. Well, I had heard about that. I had wondered about it. One time when I was down at the General Conference, I saw a whole group of people that had a big sign and so forth that said, DNA proves Book of Mormon false. I thought, well, that's interesting. And maybe someday I'll have a chance to do some research about that. Well, as it turns out, that chance came. And so I wanted to do some more research on this. Now, how did all this get started, this DNA controversy? And I'll just give you a very quick background so that you have some idea. Basically, it all started in November 16th, 1990, when the United States government passed an act, basically, called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. What had happened is anthropologists and archaeologists had, over the course of time, taken remains that had been found in many of these mounds, and folks, that we're talking, there are thousands of mounds. Now, remains had been taken away. They usually would do a little, some studies and so forth on them, and then they would be carted off and held in secured areas in universities. Well, the Indian tribes were getting a little bit upset by the fact that because these remains are sacred to them, they were getting upset because they weren't getting their remains of their ancestors back. So that's why the government passed this. Well, the problem is that some of the remains were being claimed by more than one tribe. Okay? So sometimes there would be 3 or 4 tribes that would say, no, that remains as part of our tribe. That's part of our thing. We want them. So in order to try to be fair to all the different tribes, and because of the latest technology which had just been developed in regard to DNA studies, being able to take small bits of DNA and through a process which we won't go into and so forth, be able to go ahead and group people into different, what they call haplogroups. Okay? Well, when they did this, they found that essentially this whole area, okay, all of North and South America, when they did this, they first did about 2,500 individuals from, I believe it was about 200 and something tribes, primary tribes. Now there are sub-tribes as well. When they did this, folks, they found out that all of their studies came up with all of the Indians fell into one of 4 primary haplogroups. Now those haplogroups happen to be, and they distinguish them, they call them A, B, C, and D. A haplogroup happened to be primarily located up in Alaska. B was in the central here, and so forth. Okay? And all of these A, B, C, and D haplogroups, folks, are Asian-based DNA. In other words, there was no trace of DNA that came from Europe or Israel. Now, that set off a little bit of a firestorm because you see, if the Book of Mormon is real, and I believe that it is, and if these people were here, their DNA traces would have to be here. There would have to be evidence for them having lived and their lives and died here. And so I was going, okay, so what's going on with that? Okay. Well, unfortunately, now that's the Repatriation Act was in 1990. There were several people, not a few. We're talking about bishops. We're talking about lots of members of the church all over the world, specifically who are scientifically based in their employment, who had major issues with this. The magazine Science. Okay, science and nature are the 2 biggies in science today. This is an article in Science, Volume 280, Issue 5363, 24th April, 1998. Same time as the first book was written. And in here, I want you to note this blue section right here. It says, genes may link ancient Eurasians and Native Americans. Okay, next. This is a close-up view of that thing. Now, if you'll notice down here, X marks the spot. The genetic variant called X is found in Native Americans and some Eurasian populations, but not in Asians. This lineage X has been confirmed through DNA studies to exist in Finland, Italy, and Israel. Okay? Does that ring any bells? Let's go to the next. In there, this section here, here, and here is on the next slide. Go ahead. Give that. Okay, so again, we're in Science, 1998. I'm just going to read a little bit about this. Anthropologists have long assumed that the first Americans who crossed into North America by way of the Bering Strait were originally of Asian stock, but recently they have been puzzled by surprising features on a handful of ancient American skeletons, including the controversial one known as Kennewick Man. Features that resemble those of Europeans rather than Asians. Now, a new genetic study may link Native Americans and people of Europe and the Middle East, offering tantalizing support to the controversial theory that a band of people who originally lived in Europe or Israel or Asia Minor were among the continent's first settlers. This new data from a genetic marker appropriately called lineage X suggests a definite, if ancient, link between Eurasians and Native Americans. Okay, down a little bit further. Just as we said before, researchers have already identified 4 common genetic variants called haplogroups A, B, C, D in the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, by the way, folks, is the DNA that is passed down from mothers to daughters. Okay,